All right, I came up with this logo by myself. This is something original to me. You've probably never seen a logo that looks anything like that. But anyway, AI helped us, as I've said, and so we are starting a sermon series called Back to the Beginning, and obviously Back to the Future logo, right? So that's, just switch it up a little bit. So back to the beginning. We're going to study over the next 13 weeks. We're going to study Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Those of you who are on Facebook, hopefully you saw and liked and shared and promoted the promo video that I put out yesterday with a thought field in the background behind me. Callie is my director, Linda is my producer, and we only had to shoot it in one take. No. Anyway, but look, it is unedited. I'm not a video editor. There's a lot of time and money involved in that. But anyway, we recorded it a few times. One of the times my dog was walking behind me and crunching through the leaves, and we tried another part of the yard. We tried Friday night. I was wanting to put it out Friday night, and we had a nice ambiance outside with a sunset, and the mosquitoes were eating us up. It was unbelievable. And so then we tried earlier in the day Saturday, and it was windy, it was beautiful outside, and so trying to use the windscreen on the microphone. But anyway, those of you who are on Facebook, if you can like and comment and share that stuff, repost on your own Facebook page. It helps us with analytics. It's not just because I'm proud and I want it to be out there. It's that it helps us with analytics. If people are going to see it, you have to be engaged with it some way. So you can do a thumbs up, or you can write super duper, or you can say looking forward to it, or you can say okay, or you can type okay. Just anything on that digital media so that it can be promoted. So we're going to begin today. We're going to go back to the beginning, all right? And basically, I want to divide the book of Genesis in this way. I think this is probably the easiest way to do it. Now, for those of you who are taking notes, especially for the kiddos. All right? After the sermon today, let me get a bulletin here. After the sermon today, so my sermon's going to include the first 4, Dad's sermon's going to include the last 3. If you show me that you've been listening, and if you show me that you've taken notes, I have a little incentive for you. I've got a Bible Facts bookmark I'd really like to, Brooklyn, Vanna, I'd really like to give you. But you have to listen and you have to fill out the notes in the bulletin, okay? So we're going to do some incentivized learning. I'm a big fan of incentivized learning. And if you guys, I'll just tell you, if you guys collect all these, what I don't give away to the kids, some of you older folks, if you'd like one, if you collect all these, you're going to have a really nice resource with a ton of material. We're not going to do it every Sunday, and if I need to order some more, I can order some more. If others would like to, it's like some of the older people bring it. I filled out the sermon outline today. I'm like, well, I'm out of bookmarks. So the kids come first. If the kids do it, the kids are going to get a bookmark. And then whatever I have left, we might charge for it. But anyway. All right. So one of the best ways to divide the Old Testament is 4x2 or 2x4. Okay? However you want to say it. I had 4x2 originally, and then I changed it to 2x4 because we're used to for those of us who've done any building or any sort of construction, we're used to the 2x4 language, right? 2x4x8 or whatever. If we're framing a house or a chicken coop or whatever, we're used to the idea of 2x4s. So in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you essentially have 4 events, okay? You have the creation, you have sin or the fall of man, and then you have the flood in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and then you have the Tower of Babel. So you can remember the book of Genesis in this way. The first 4 chapters is 4 events, or the first section, the first of that 11 chapters is 4 events. The creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel. The second section of the book of Genesis includes 4 men. So you have 4 events in the first part. In the second part, you have 4 men: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so just with those 8 words there that you see on the screen, well, the 9 words, sin and fall, combined there, right? With the words you see on the screen, you can organize the book of Genesis in that way. So you have the creation, you have the fall, you have the flood, you have Babel, you have Abraham, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. That may be one of the easiest ways for us to outline the book of Genesis. Okay? So today, what Dad and I are going to do, we're going to do a snapshot of the Bible. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 1 through 11, but we're also going to step back. What I'm going to deal with is going to be the four main events, just introducing the four main events that we're going to study as we study over the next 13 weeks. This study will carry us through the end of the year, Lord willing. We will study Genesis chapter 1 through 11. The first quarter in the year of 2026, January, February, and March, we're going to study up to Joseph, and then after 6 months, we'll bounce to the New Testament and study the New Testament 6 months, and then we'll go back to the Old Testament and study the Old Testament 6 months. And so throughout the course of roughly 4 years, that's kind of how we're planning it, right? Roughly 4 years, we're going to study through the entirety of the Bible. What we want to do today is take a step back and look at the snapshot of the Bible. The four things we're going to look at this morning are found in Genesis chapter 1 through 11. All right, I have about 2,000 years of human history that we're going to discuss this morning. Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is about 2,000 years of human history. And then in the afternoon hour, Dad is going to look at the New Testament. He's going to look at Christ and the cross and completion. So we've broken these down into 7 C's. All right, so the first C is creation. The first C is creation. And we read about the creation, right, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 is the creation account. And Genesis chapter 1 gives us the creation account, and Genesis chapter 2 zooms in on humanity. This was a common style of writing in Hebrew writing, okay? So we'll see a similar thing when we get to Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, we see the table of nations, and then it kind of goes back and zooms in. Genesis chapter 11 zooms in on the Tower of Babel and how essentially that table of nations was formed. So in Genesis chapter 1, we have the creation account. In Genesis chapter 2, we have the Hebrew author, Moses, right? Wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's pretty much undisputed in the scholarly world. Those who are disputed dispute that Moses is the author of maybe some of the book of Deuteronomy or some of the first 5 books. In my opinion, they're not very scholarly. So we will say that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The second word we have is the word corruption. All right? So the first sin, Adam and Eve, God gave them a command. We'll read through some of this in a minute. But you have Adam and Eve. God tells them not to eat of a certain fruit, and what happens? They eat of that certain fruit that God tells them not to eat of. And so it gets worse from there. So you have the first sin in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 4, you have the first murder. Cain kills his brother Abel. Well, even before that sin, you have another sin. You have the first perverted worship that we read about in the Bible. Abel's worship was according to what God had commanded. Cain's worship was not according to what God had commanded. So he killed his brother because he was angry and because he was envious of his brother. All right, so let's go now to Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we're going to call this catastrophe. If you want to write the word flood, if it's easier for you, you can write the word flood. Okay? This global catastrophe that begins in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 record the events surrounding the global flood, right? The flood of Noah's day. The earth was so wicked. Men were drifting further and further away from God, and God tells Noah, I'm going to destroy my creation with the flood. And we read in 1 Peter chapter 3 that only 8 souls were saved through water. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 wives. There you go. So you have 8 people that were saved in the ark of safety. And God made a covenant with them that He would protect them, He would keep them safe. And after they got off of the ark, they were told to disperse, but they didn't disperse. And that's where we have confusion. So confusion basically covers Genesis chapters 10 and 11. Genesis chapter, and you guys can just flip along with me as we go through. I have some headings, some things we'll cover as we go through. Genesis chapter 10 describes the table of the nations. It tells us where different tribes and ethnicities and languages came from. Okay, and then Genesis chapter 11 zooms in on that one event that we call the Tower of Babel, right? Where God had commanded after the flood that peoples disperse, fill the earth, multiply, subdue it. Well, instead of doing what God commanded them to do, they decided to stay in Mesopotamia. And we have some fun lessons toward the end of this study about the Tower of Babel. I have a hope, Lord willing, if I can crop and show you a portion of the video, I'd like to show you a portion of a video of an archaeologist that gives a few options for maybe where the tower, they think they found at least the platform where the Tower of Babel could have been located. So this is some fun stuff, right? And so they decide they're going to build this tower. And instead of dispersing, instead of multiplying and filling the earth, they want to stay in Mesopotamia. They want to build this tower to the heavens. And God looks down and He says, this thing that they're doing is not good. And He confuses the languages. And so that's where we get our language roots from, and our nationalities and our ethnicities. I don't like to use the word race just because the connotation that race implies. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We're all one race, right? Acts chapter 17, we're all one blood of people. We can all trace our ancestry, whether we're white or whether we're black or whether we're yellow or whether we're brown or whatever we are. We can all trace our ancestry back to the original ancestors, Adam and Eve. When some people open the Bible, this is what they say. Well, the Bible it's just a book of interesting stories. And I would agree, the Bible's a book of interesting stories, but the Bible is so much more than just interesting stories, right? It's more than just stories that we learned when we were children. Somebody might say, well, the Bible is a book full of myths and fables, right? And so, well, you have in Genesis chapter 3, you have a talking snake, right? There's a fable. In Genesis chapter 6 and 7, you have the story of a global flood. And so some are going to assert that the flood was only local, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Some say the Bible is good moral teaching, which it is, right? We would agree that the Bible is theological. We would agree that the Bible is good moral teaching, but it's more than that. I took a semester at Indiana University. I only could handle one semester. I took a political science class with a feminist. That was a lot of fun. I took a philosophy class with a professor who left us guessing whether or not he was atheist or agnostic or Christian. That was a fun class. I enjoyed that class a lot. One of the classes that I took at Indiana University was ancient civilizations. All right? Ancient civilizations. And the guy that was teaching this undergraduate class, he was a graduate student. He was an assistant professor. Okay? And so we were having one particular class where he was giving the date of the ancient Sumerians and the ancient Akkadians and the ancient Mesopotamians, and he was giving us a date like 10,000, 20,000 BC. And he made this statement, which I thought was interesting. He made this statement in class, and let me just describe the class. This is at a big university. This is a class of like 200-300 students, and we're in an auditorium. And if you're a student, you're not supposed to disagree with the graduate student who's teaching your class. You are not supposed to disagree with the associate professor. And so he makes a statement that we really don't have a lot of history. We don't have a lot of documents that came out of the Mesopotamian time period, right? He was dating at 4,000, a lot older than I would date it. And so I raised my hand. And I said, well, So we do have some narratives. Actually, we do. They're found in the Bible. And so he wants to, well, we can't trust the Bible. And I had this conversation with him, and we went back and forth for a minute or two, and I said my piece, and he said his piece, and I didn't do well in that class, but anyway. Because I'll just tell you, when you go to college, agree with your professor and just write what they want to hear, right? Don't try to make sense, just write what they want to hear. They say this is a theory, or this is what Professor so-and-so believes. If nothing more, you have to accept the Bible as ancient world history. If nothing more, even if you lay aside the interesting stories, and even if you lay aside the redemption, and even if you lay aside the moral teaching. And I said, well, we have the story of Abraham. Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, right smack in the middle of Mesopotamia. We have the story of Job, who was a man from Uz, right in the smack of Mesopotamia. We have the events that took place in the Garden of Eden. We have the record in Genesis chapter 6 through 9 of the global flood. We have the events described that talk about the Tower of Babel, and the archaeological record confirms through material culture like pottery and other things that there was a center of the world at one time, and people dispersed. If nothing more, we have to accept the Bible as foundational history. And I believe it's the inspired Word of God. And I believe that it teaches us about God. And I believe that it is a book about morality. I believe that it's a book about redemption. I believe all those things. But I also believe that it can be historically trusted. I believe, now call me crazy, right? Because secularists are going to call me crazy. I believe that the Bible can be historically trusted, and it's foundational for us to assert that what we read in Genesis 1 through 11 are not myths. What we read in Genesis chapter 1 through 11 are not fables. They're more than just interesting stories. They are history about the origin of man.
Amen.
They are history about the origin of sin. They are history about God's plan for saving a sinful man. Let's dive into number 1. Creation. Creation. Item number 1, creation. Now you read about the creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. I'm not going to read all these verses. I'll encourage you over the course of this study that as you know that a particular sermon is coming up, it would be good for you in between now and next week to read Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Read it a few times. That would be good for you in between now and next week. So let's start with a creation account. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It's interesting that at creation, no one is there except God. No one can give us a record. No one can provide for us an accurate record of how creation happened except for God. Because God was there. Have you ever been in conversations with someone, maybe you're telling a story about a time or a day or an event, and then they want to jump in and add to your story, and you're like, well, you weren't even there. How do you know what happened? You weren't even there. God was the one there at creation. And so what we have in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is an inspired account of foundational human history. God was there, and God allows us to be a part of that by recording how it happened. Look at verse 3. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night, so the evening and morning were the first day. Then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And God called the firmament heaven, so the evening and the morning were the second day. I'm not going to read through all this. You guys know the creation account, right? Well, we sing the little kid song, right? The little kid song. The little kid song we all sang growing up, right? Day one, God made light when there was none. Day two, God made clouds and skies so blue. Day three, God made flowers and grass and trees. Day four, sun and moon and stars galore. And I'll just tell you this. One of my favorite verses is Genesis chapter 1 and verse 16. I live out in the country. I'll just tell you that, guys. I live out in the country. The only light that we have out there is basically my shop light. And I control it. I plug it in and out. And so there are several times during the year when I can go out with a naked eye. I can see 5, 6 planets with a naked eye. Almost every evening I can go out on my sidewalk outside of my house and I can see the Milky Way. Those of you who live in the city, you can't do that. Those of you who live where there are a lot of lights, you can't do those things. Maybe those things are obscured by your vision. One of my favorite verses in all of Genesis chapter 1 is Genesis chapter 1 and verse 16. Then God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, that's called the sun, the lesser light to rule the night, we call that the moon. Look at this. He made the stars also. And in the Hebrew, that's 3 words. It's the stars also. And it's just like, oh, by the way, God made the stars also. Right? We can't count the billions and billions and billions of stars and galaxies. It's just, you have a few words. Oh, by the way, God made those. That's fascinating, isn't it? We look around at the amazing creation, the wonderful things that God made, and we can't help but glory and praise God. Here's some facts about the creation. The creation occurred about 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago. Well, how do we know? When we look at the dates, when we look at the geological records, that the Bible contains, that Genesis chapter 5 contains, and that Genesis chapter 10 contains, it's interesting that God gave us those numbers. So-and-so lived so many years, and he had a son. And his son lived so many years, and he had a son. And the first guy died in this year, and the second guy died, and so we have a record of humanity that begins about 4000 BC. I want to give you that number. I am unapologetically a young earth creationist. Unapologetically. Not every preacher in the Lord's church is that way, right? You have other views. You have views that say theistic evolution. You have gap theories and you have day-age theories. We'll talk more about that at another lesson. I think that may be next week. I think that's next week's lesson. God created the universe over a period of 6 24-hour days and rested on the 7th day. How do we know that it's a 24-hour day? Because the Bible says it. Right? The evening and the morning, that's how, when the sun went down, that was the end of the day. They didn't wait until midnight like we do, around 6 or 7 p.m. Well, it's 7 p.m. for us now, right? Like 6:53 p.m. When the sun goes down, guess what? Tonight at 6:53 p.m. when the sun goes down, it's Monday, according to God. All right? That's what Genesis chapter 1 says. The evening and the morning were what? The first day. The evening and the morning. You have that 6 times. And then you have on the 7th day, God rested. Let's go to the end of Genesis chapter 1. Look at verse 31. Then God saw everything that he had made. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the 6th day. After God created man, he said it's very good. Up until now, he says it's good, 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 good. Very good. After he creates man. God's creation was very good. He did not create sin. Right? He did not create death. He did not create corruption. James says in James chapter 1 and verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. That's our God. That's the God I serve. Sometimes do we blame God for misfortune in our life? I'm talking with a Christian brother right now. He's studying with a woman, and he was things were going well. And then her 11-month-old grandbaby dies. And she says, how could God take my 11-month-old grandbaby? Now, guys, I'll tell you this as lovingly as I can. God is not in the business of killing your grandchildren. He's not. That's not the God that we serve. The God that we serve created all things good and created all things perfect and created all things blessed and sanctified for His glory. As we examine the Bible genealogies, Adam lived about 2,000 years before Abraham and about 4,000 years before Christ. You know, you and I are 25 this year, right? So we're about 2,025 years after the birth of Christ. Let me just tell you this. Let me add this nugget. I'm not going to use CE and BCE. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use the Common Era and the Before Common Era acronyms that are so common even in religious and scholarly writing. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue to use BC, and I'm going to continue to use AD. I do that unapologetically. All right? And if you're not comfortable with that, I apologize. But I'm not going to cater to the worldviews of political correctness of today. Okay? So Adam lived about 2,000 years before Abraham. Abraham lived about 2,000 years before Christ. You and I live about 2,000 years after Christ. How old does that tell you the earth is? About 6,000 years. Guys, I'm no good mathematician. I'll be the first one to tell you that. But 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 6. It doesn't equal billions and billions and billions of years. That's the biblical worldview. This is fun. I just found this morning. If you notice where I got this article from, where I got these numbers from, history.com, the History Channel. And I'll just tell you this. The History Channel is not a fan of Christianity. Right? There are some things on the History Channel, it's like eating fish. You got to eat the meat and you got to spit the bones out. The History Channel is not a fan of the biblical worldview. I don't agree with numbers 1 and 2. We'll talk more about when we get to Egypt, because the secular dating of the Egyptian dynasties is off, because it doesn't include the overlaps of some of the pharaohs. Some of the dynasties overlap, so it really doesn't go back to 3100 BC. The Egyptian dynasties didn't exist until after the flood. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But even the History Channel says that the concrete evidence that we have about the age of humanity, about the oldest civilizations on earth, dates back to ancient Mesopotamia, about 4000 BC. That's pretty cool. Well, I just said that in another slide. Look at that. That's on my first line. Even the History Channel agrees with that. Now, that doesn't take into account what my smart aleck graduate professor said at IU, that the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians and Mesopotamians, it was about 10,000, 20,000 years ago. Even the History Channel disagrees with that. I thought that was pretty interesting. Number 2, here's our second C, corruption. Or you can use the word sin. You can use the word sin. So in the narrative in Genesis chapter 2, when God is zooming in at His creation of Adam and Eve, notice what's said in verses 16 and 17, Genesis chapter 2. Any of you like hummingbirds? Right? The hummingbirds have been hitting your feeders and your flowers real hard, right? Because they're getting ready to leave. They're getting ready to fly away for the winter, and then they'll be back in the early spring. I love hummingbirds. I like watching them. And when I think of a hummingbird, I think of a garden, right? So you have flower gardens, you have red or you have orange plants outside your house. In Mississippi, I could sit out. So we had so many hummingbirds in Mississippi. I could literally sit outside with my red hat on, and I could hold a feeder in my hand, and hummingbirds would come to my hand and sit on my hand, perch on my finger, perch on the nectar feeder that I was holding in my hand. And I thought to myself, this must have been what it was like in the garden. Adam and Eve are just hanging out in God's creation. All the animals are around them. This beautiful creation. Hummingbirds are landing, right? It's like Snow White. She's singing and whistling, and all the animals come to Snow White. And that's what it was like. Before sin corrupted things, and before the animals were afraid of people, but what happened? Sin messed it up. God tells Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2, in verses 16 and 17, he commands the man. It's inferred that the man tells his wife. She knows something in Genesis chapter 3. She doesn't get it entirely right, but she knows something. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. There it is. Right? When God speaks, that means something. God says, let there be light. What happens? It's done. God says, let the waters from above be divided from the waters from below. It's done. God says, let the land be separated from the waters. It's done. When God speaks, things happen. God means what he says, doesn't it? God means what he says. Now you get to Genesis chapter 3. Let's begin reading in verse 1. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? He's like, well, God doesn't let you eat of any tree, does he? Well, he lets us eat of some trees. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree desirable to make one wise, right? That's the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Where does that come from? That's the original sin. That's the same way that Jesus was tempted, by the way. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made for themselves coverings. So you have sin. You have the first sin in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 4, you have the first perverted worship. You have the first murder. In Genesis chapter 5, you have the first polygamist. And so, here's one thing I want you to see. When sin rears its ugly head, when the doors of sin are opened, what happens? It begins to run rampant. What do we see in our society today when the door of sin runs rampant? In politics, or in judges, or when crime and chaos, when those things are not punished, what's going to happen? Sin is going to run rampant. And there's going to be more and more and more sin until we get to Genesis chapter 6. And God says, I've had enough. I've had enough. You ever hear somebody talk about the good old days? Right? Oh, back in my day. And then they look out at the world in which we live now and they say, it's never been as bad as it is now. Have you read Genesis chapter 6? Have you read the few verses here in Genesis chapter 6? Look at verses 6 and 7. Well, we'll read 5 through 7. That's what I have up there. I think that's a good place to read. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's pretty bad. Somebody says, well, it's never been that bad before. Go back and read Genesis chapter 6. And the Lord sorrowed that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. A global flood, a global catastrophe. And God told this, Noah, I'm going to need you to build a big box. It's getting ready to rain. getting ready to rain. And Noah says, okay. And over the period of 120 years, Noah builds a box and he prepares for this catastrophe, this great global flood. Let's jump down to Genesis chapter 7. And I want to read beginning in verse 11 through 21. And here's what we need to assert. Here's what the biblical worldview is that it was a global flood. It was a worldwide flood. This was not just a localized flood. You can go out to the Grand Canyon today. You can go to Colorado and Utah today, and you can see the Great Divide. You can see where these layers after layers of sedimentary silt and sand and other things were laid down as the floodwaters went up on land and as the floodwaters receded. Every time that waters went up on land, as that water began to recede, it would leave sediment behind. And we see evidence of that all over the earth. All over the earth. There's evidence of a global catastrophe that we read about in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Let's begin reading in verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. The windows of heaven were opened. So here's what it's saying. Rain came from above, and water came from above, and water came from below. It sprung out of the ocean floor. All the springs were opened up. I'll just tell you this. I'm a big fan of springs. I like springs. We live in a cool part of the world. We have a ton of springs around here. Big Spring is cool. Went to Big Spring a couple years ago. I'd like to go there in another few weeks and see the fall leaves again. Big Spring is fun if you've been there. Alley Spring and Mill. That's a pretty cool place to go. Blue Spring, we've been to that one. I've not been to Mammoth Spring, the one in Arkansas. I've not been to the one in Arkansas. But we have some really cool springs around. And all these springs, whether it be in the ocean or whether it be on land, God opened them up to the fullest. He turned the tap on high. And so you have rain coming from above, you have water rising from below. The mountains that existed before the flood were not as mountainous as they are now. Those things happened during the time of the flood. And so God opened everything up. Look at verse 12. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah, Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark. And they spent about a year. They spent a little over a year on the ark. That's a lot of water, isn't it? That's a lot of water. Here's some things we can learn about the flood. Number one, it occurred about 2350 BC. When you look at the genealogies, it's exactly 1656 years after Adam was created. All right? So I think the number I gave you when we were going through Old Testament history, oh, by the way, guys, I'm going to print this stuff off and give them and provide you some of these numbers, okay? So about 1600 years, 1656 to be exact, after creation is when Noah's flood took place. It was a global flood. It was not just a local flood. That's the account of Genesis chapter 7. It killed every human. It killed every land-dwelling animal in whom was the breath of life. Everything that was not on the ark died during this global flood, during this year period that Noah and his family spent in the ark. Here's some interesting facts about the flood. It greatly impacted the geological layers. It buried billions of living creatures with sediment. We call those fossils, right? It greatly impacted the tectonic plates, causing massive earthquakes, causing massive volcanoes, causing hurricanes the size of continents. All those things happened during the global flood. The Ice Age was caused by the flood. Somebody said, well, how's the Ice Age caused by the flood? All of that seismic activity. What happens when a volcano erupts? It spews ash and dust into the atmosphere, and it cooled the planet down. And so after the flood, Noah and his family couldn't travel north because it was too cold. The Caucasus Mountains were to the north of where the ark landed, so they had to travel south to Mesopotamia. Let's move on. Genesis chapter 11. And so here's our fourth C of the day. Genesis, and so this is kind of a motorcycle through the museum, if you will. All right? So Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. God commanded after the flood that people disperse all over the face of the earth. You guys disperse, fill the earth, be fruitful, multiply, subdue it. Now, they didn't do that. And so here's what you read in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Well, God said that they were to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the Son of Man had built. And the Lord said, Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, confusion, Babylon, Mesopotamia, right? Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Here's some facts about Babel. Number one, Babel demonstrates the history of peoples, or if you want to use the word races, if you want to use the word ethnicity, the history of peoples, tongues, and nations. And you read in Revelation chapter 7, 9, this same language is used in glorifying God and glorifying the Lamb. That people of all tongues, tribes, nations, and languages are going to praise God for an eternity in heaven. Here's what else it tells us. The table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 is that we're all from one race. We're all from Adam and Eve. We're all descendants from Adam and Eve. That's what Paul says in his sermon on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26, that God has made from one blood all the nations. Right? We're all from them. There is no such thing as a race. Right? A person that has more melanin in his skin, or a person that has less melanin in his skin, they have all come from Adam and Eve. They all come from the same two ancestors. The Tower of Babel created the main language branches that we see today, the families that we see today. Let me show you an interesting verse. Look at Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25. This guy's name is Peleg, not Pegleg, Peleg. And we can see what it says in Genesis 10:25, that in his days, in Peleg's days, the earth was divided. Okay? And so we can track the genealogy until we get down to Peleg, and then we say it was in his days that the earth was divided. It was in his days that God confused the language. And then Moses in chapter 11 zooms in on what the confusion of that language looked like. And when we look at the genealogy, we can see this. The events of Babel happened about 2240 BC. All right? About 2240 BC. So, we've covered about 2,000 years of human history just in our lesson this morning. All right? Genesis chapter 1 through 11 covers about 2,000 years of human history. What are some things that we can learn from these first 11 chapters? Number one, we can learn that God means what He says. That when God speaks, there's an expectation there. Let there be light, it's done. Don't eat from the tree in the midst of the garden. Well, He created us with free will, didn't He? He did. We can choose to obey God or disobey. What else do these chapters in Genesis tell us? there's consequences that goes along with our choices. That there's sin. What else do these chapters tell us? Even though we messed it up, God still has a plan to save man. Right? God covered Adam and Eve's nakedness. He covered their shame with the first animal sacrifice. Cain and Abel had opportunities to sacrifice and cause themselves to be righteous before God. He told Noah, he allowed Noah to build an ark and preserve his family. And you get a beautiful picture in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 3, talking about how in the same way that water saved Noah through the ark, baptism also saves us in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21. It's not all bad news in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 1 through 11. It also offers hope. It tells us about God. It tells us about man. It tells us about sin. But these chapters also offer hope. And in the afternoon sermon, Dad is going to deal with that hope by stepping back and looking at what the Bible says about that hope is and where that hope is located. We'll sing a song of invitation. If you need to respond, please come while we stand and while we sing.
Careless soul, why will you linger,
wandering from